You'll share my bed tonight, human.
Your bed? Tonight?
That's what I said.
Princess, I'm still human.
I know.
Then why me?
By sunrise, every kingdom will know
No W-H-A-T?
that I chose you.
The corridor aboard the Valkyrie flagship Varanthe was cold enough that Webb could see his breath, which was interesting. The Valkyrie were clearly capable of precise environmental calibration. The ship had been running at temperatures he'd estimated around 12 degrees Celsius since he'd been brought aboard, a specific chill that suggested deliberate choice rather than oversight. They were either accustomed to cold or they'd done research on human discomfort thresholds and decided this particular level was a useful place to begin. He filed that away. He'd been filing things since Kepler Station. The file was getting thick. His escort consisted of 2 Valkyrie guardians who moved with the unsettling, fluid quality he'd observed. In all of them joints that operated on slightly different constraints than human joints, a smoothness that read as almost mechanical. Until you caught the micro-adjustments, the tiny living corrections of bodies navigating living space. They wore armor in the Valkyrie fashion, form-fitting and organic-looking, dark as deep space, with bioluminescent lines along the shoulder joints and the backs of the hands that pulsed slowly in a pale violet that matched the doors ahead. The doors were 3 times his height. They opened inward without a sound. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, the guardian on his left, said, in English that carried no trace of learning, no accent, no approximation, just clean human syllables produced by something that didn't quite have a human mouth. You will walk forward. You will speak when spoken to. You will show no aggression. Understood, Webb said. He walked through. The chamber beyond wasn't a throne room, exactly. Webb had enough operational experience in human seats of power to understand the grammar of the thing, the way space gets organized, to make whoever stands at its center seem inevitable. And the Valkyrie version used different vocabulary, but the same fundamental grammar. Curved walls that drew every sightline toward the far end. Ambient light that fell differently there, slightly warmer, slightly cleaner, a gradient that existed to make one point more real than everything around it. About 30 Valkyrie in formal arrangement, their bioluminescent markings cycling in patterns he was still learning to read. Gold meant authority. The blue adjacent color he'd started thinking of as slate meant deliberation. Something in the red range that didn't quite match any human red meant attention. He was getting a great deal of red range attention. He walked the length of the chamber. His right boot had a split in the sole that let in a thin finger of cold with every step. He focused on that. Concrete. Real. It had kept him functional in the relay room, while Chen was dying at the junction, and it would keep him functional here. 11 people had gone into the Kepler Station defense with him. He'd come out. He put that in the file with everything else and kept walking. The woman at the far end of the chamber was everything the briefing files had under-equipped him for. She was tall even for Valkyrie, 6.5 feet, maybe closer to 7, with extra presence coming not from genetics but from the particular way she occupied space. Something in her posture that made her seem to fill more vertical distance than her body actually required. Her skin was the silver gray of all Valkyrie, but the bioluminescent markings on her face were more complex than anything Webb had seen in any briefing footage. Branching patterns along her cheekbones that climbed toward her temples, like frost, accumulating on glass over years, intricate and layered, the kind of pattern that looked old in the way that only genuinely complicated things developed that quality. She wore formal armor robes in the Valkyrie fashion, dark as the space between stars, with silver geometric work threaded through the fabric that caught the ambient light differently than everything around it, as if it operated by a slightly different set of physical laws. She had 4 eyes, 2 primary ones at the height where human eyes would be, and 2 smaller secondary eyes set 4 centimeters lower, slightly offset. All 4 were the pale amber of old resin. All 4 were tracking him as he walked toward her with the same quality of attention, which gave her gaze a binocular depth he couldn't quite process with peripheral awareness he'd spent years developing. He stopped at 10 feet. He clasped his hands at his back, the parade rest position that was technically a military courtesy for superior officers, which she was not. In any hierarchy he was bound to respect, but which had the secondary utility of being a posture that communicated both composure and the absence of immediate hostile intent. The room went quiet, not anticipatory quiet, held breath quiet. She spoke. Her voice carried the Valkyrie subsonic harmonic he'd been briefed on, a bass resonance beneath her actual words that he felt in his sternum more than heard, the vibration of very large machinery in an enclosed space. A translation unit somewhere in the chamber, unobtrusive, environmental. Not Warren rendered her Valkyrie into English with the flat, airless precision of very good software. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, she said, you are the sole surviving member of the unit that held Kepler Station for 71 hours against the 4th Fleet of the Varanthi Arm. You destroyed 11 warships of the Imperium and damaged 7 more. You killed 143 Valkyrie. A pause. That is more than any single human unit has accomplished since the opening of this conflict. Webb said nothing. You were taken alive because I ordered it so. She moved not toward him, a shift of weight that somehow changed the geometry of the room. I have reviewed your tactical records. I have studied the improvised weapons systems your unit deployed in the final hours of the engagement. I have read the after-action reports, filed by the officers who recovered the station. She looked at him with all 4 amber eyes.
You interest me, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb.
Glad to hear it, Webb said. A few of the 30 Valkyrie shifted. Several bioluminescent patterns did something in the slate blue range. The princess looked at him without expression. I am Princess Saravan Valthari, she said. Heir to the Valkyrie Imperium, commander of the Varanthi Arm, speaker of the Concordance Circle. She let those rest. And I have an offer to make you. One more pause, and inside the pause something was being prepared, something that the room already knew about, and he didn't. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, you will share my chamber tonight. The 30 Valkyrie around the room went completely still. Webb held the silence for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds he noticed a great many things. He noticed the stillness was not the stillness of people watching expected ceremony. It was the stillness of people watching something they had not anticipated, people recalibrating in real time. He noticed none of that reaction seemed directed at him. It was directed at her. He noticed the Valkyrie official to his left, older, elaborate shoulder markings, bioluminescent cycling in a gold-red pattern with the quality of someone holding position under significant internal pressure, step forward half a step, and then stop himself. He noticed the translation had produced English that was grammatically unambiguous and contextually strange. The particular quality of a phrase that doesn't quite survive crossing from one meaning system to another. The way idiomatic concepts always lose something in transit, and he noticed, in the amber eyes of the princess, all 4 of them. Tracking him with that depth, something he couldn't name, but could feel the shape of. It wasn't the expectation of compliance. It wasn't predatory patience. It was something more fragile than either of those. Something that, if he'd seen it on a human face as in a human context, he would have called hope. He filed it with everything else. He took one breath. Your Highness, Webb said, and his voice came out level and even, which was its own kind of victory. I've had better offers from people who were actively trying to kill me. The room changed. Bioluminescent patterns flickered across 30 faces, gold to white to sequences he had no vocabulary for yet. 2 guardians stepped forward, stopped, apparently mid-instruction, waiting for an update that hadn't arrived. The official with the gold-red bioluminescence, he had a title. Webb was certain of it. Something that would translate as High Counselor made a sound that wasn't quite language. The princess looked at him. She looked at him the way someone looks at a calculation that has returned an unexpected value, and they're not yet certain whether the error is in the data or the formula. Her chin lifted. The frost glass patterns on her cheekbones brightened to a cold, precise silver. You refuse, she said. The translation gave it no inflection. He was fairly certain that wasn't the translation's failure. I don't know exactly what I'm refusing, Webb said. But yes, whatever the offer is, I refuse. The High Counselor spoke in Valkyrie, rapid, flat, with the cadence of formal objection, and the translation unit rendered none of it. The princess turned toward him by approximately 2 degrees, which somehow constituted a complete answer, and replied in 4 words. The High Counselor's bioluminescence, when a shade of red Webb would later understand, was the Valkyrie version of Knuckles going white. The penalty for refusing the Kaveth Narum, the princess said, returning to Webb, is death. This is law. All right, Webb said. Then I want my reasons on the record, if that concept operates here. I am Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb of the Earth Defense Forces. I was taken prisoner under the conditions of this conflict. Under the laws of my people, I'm required to provide only name, rank, and identification, not to participate in rituals. I don't understand with enemy heads of state, regardless of what your law says about the penalty. I'm not saying this to be difficult. I'm saying it because it's true, and because you deserve the actual reason rather than a polite version that leaves the substance out. The princess was very still. I also want to be clear, Webb continued, that I'm not trying to disrespect you. I don't know what the Kveth Narum is. Maybe refusing it is the galactic equivalent of burning someone's flag, and I'm not aware of that. But I won't agree to something I don't understand, and I won't pretend to be anything other than what I am, which is a human soldier who is currently a prisoner of war. Your law wasn't written to account for what I am. That's not my failure to comply. That's a gap in your law's jurisdiction. He stopped speaking. The silence lasted long enough that he started running quiet calculations on distances and reaction times, and all the answers came back not good, but he kept running them anyway because it was something concrete to do. The princess turned to the room, not to Webb, to the room and spoke a single sentence. What it produced was complicated. Several conversations started simultaneously. The High Counselor's voice rose by half a register. Two younger officials moved toward the princess and were intercepted by one of her guardians. She spoke two more sentences, the second with the tone of someone issuing a final decision rather than continuing a discussion, and then turned back to Webb. The penalty for refusing the Kveth Narum is death, she said. Exactly the same words. Exactly the same tone. This is law. She held 2 beats of silence. I do not intend to enforce it. The High Counselor said something that needed no translation. You are unique, she said, over whatever was happening in the room behind her, with the complete calm of someone who has made a decision and is done with revision. Every human soldier taken in this conflict has either complied immediately or died preventing capture. You have done neither. Something in her 4 eyes changed the amber deepening by a degree, a quality passing through them that had a direction, like warmth from a source rather than ambient temperature. You argued. It saved my life before, Webb said. The corner of her mouth moved. It was a minimal thing. It was absolutely intentional. She turned to the room and spoke for approximately 20 seconds, issuing instructions, each producing its own quality of response from the assembly, all of it being filed through the correct architecture of authority. Then one of his guardians took his arm in a grip that was not harsh, but was not negotiable, and a smaller door on the left side of the chamber had opened. Webb went with it. 3 steps, then stopped. The guardian's grip tightened, recalibrated, released. Webb looked back over his shoulder. Saravan had already turned back to the room, to whatever conversation the assembly required of her. She stopped. One question, Webb said. She waited. What does it actually mean, the Kveth Narum? What were you asking? The silence went on long enough that he thought she'd decided to let it answer for her. Tomorrow, she said. If you survive the night, we will discuss it. She turned back to the room before he could process that. He went through the door into a corridor, into a cell that was clean and temperature controlled and sized precisely for a human being. There was a surface for sleeping, a light that dimmed when he stopped moving, a sealed container near the sleeping surface that had been placed there while he was in the chamber, containing something that tasted like roasted grain, with a secondary sweet note he couldn't identify, prepared by whatever Valthyri cuisine thought a human metabolism might manage. He ate it. He sat with his back against the wall. He thought about Chen, about the High Counselor's content fury, about the way the translation unit had declined to render several key conversations. He kept coming back to what he'd seen in Saravan's eyes. The thing he'd clocked before he'd consciously named it. The thing that looked, in every register of instinct he'd developed over 12 years of operational service, so much like hope. If you survive the night, she'd said. He let the light dim around him and sat with that. He came back to full consciousness an hour later. The sound was wrong. He didn't know what about it was wrong. His ears were still calibrated to Earth sounds. Human ships, and everything aboard the Varanthe, carried slightly different acoustic signatures, a different quality to the recycled air and the hum of systems he couldn't name. But something had changed in the quality of silence outside the cell, and that change had pulled him upright in the dark, before he'd consciously decided to be awake. He sat completely still. He listened. The cell door, a section of wall that became a door when the Valkyrie wanted it to, was sealed. The violet nighttime glow had faded entirely while he slept. He was in complete darkness with his eyes still adjusting. And there was a sound on the far side of the wall that was getting closer. Not the smooth movement of guardians on routine patrol. Something more irregular. Someone moving carefully rather than efficiently. Webb got up from the sleeping surface. He put his back against the wall to the left of where the door would open, giving himself a half second they might not expect. He watched the dark and waited. The door opened. The bioluminescence of the figure in the doorway wasn't pulsing in the steady rhythm of someone moving through routine. It was cycling in short, staccato bursts, the visual equivalent of a stutter, or of something else he couldn't read but understood at the level of reflex. The figure was taller than him, thin even for Valkyrie, and carrying something in its left hand that caught the faint corridor light in a way that made his threat assessment training produce a very specific conclusion. He moved. He'd had 90 days of hand combat training against Valkyrie simulation rigs, which was 90 days more than most EDF personnel and also categorically not the same as fighting an actual Valkyrie in a dark room. He was aware of this limitation as he moved into it anyway, catching the figure's right arm, using its own forward momentum to redirect it into the wall rather than into him, getting his forearm across the figure's throat, and using his weight against the height differential. The Valkyrie was stronger. They almost always were. But this one had been expecting a human asleep in the dark, and had gotten a human already standing in the specific dark place they'd chosen, and there was roughly 3 seconds of functional advantage in that gap before strength reasserted itself. In those 3 seconds, 2 of Saravin's actual guardians came through the door. What happened next was fast and professional and didn't require Webb's participation. He released the arm he'd been holding and stepped back against the wall and watched the 2 guardians manage a Valkyrie, who'd been carrying a cutting tool, the thing he'd clocked in the doorway in a way that was efficient and impersonal, and left the intruder pinned to the floor in approximately 4 seconds. The light came up to dim violet. Webb looked at the intruder on the floor. Unfamiliar face. High shoulder markings, different pattern than the High Counselors, from a different section of whatever organizational hierarchy the Valkyrie used, but the same tier of authority. Someone with institutional standing, someone who'd decided their standing gave them the right to resolve the problem of Webb before morning arrived. One of the guardians, his escort from the corridor, the one on the left, looked at Webb. Just a look. No translation offered. He didn't know what it communicated in Valkyrie terms. In human terms, it read something like, "You're not bad at that. Who sent him?" Webb said. The guardian didn't answer. He hadn't expected one. He sat back down on the sleeping surface and waited while the intruder was removed and the door was resealed. Then he was in the dark again, with the light back to its dim violet and the silence restored. He thought about how specifically she'd said, "If you survive the night." He thought about how close those guardians had been. 30 seconds from alarm to intervention, which meant they had been stationed within 30 seconds. Which meant someone had anticipated the night might present problems and had positioned to solve them in one direction rather than the other. He lay back down. He didn't sleep again, but he wasn't afraid in any precise sense. He was past fear and into the place where everything gets very specific and very calm, where you're tracking variables and waiting for the next datum. He thought about what the Kaveth Narum was. He'd refused it without knowing. She'd offered it knowing he wouldn't know. Neither of those facts made sense in the framework he'd walked into the throne chamber with, which was the framework of a prisoner of war being managed by the enemy with specific intent. The framework where every gesture had a tactical purpose and generosity was leverage in disguise. That framework had covered all of the possibilities he'd anticipated. It had not covered whatever was actually happening. He filed that too. He was getting very good at filing things that he didn't yet know what to do with. At some point in the early hours, someone replaced the empty food container with a new one. Brief disturbance of air. The sound of something placed down precisely. When he looked, there was a sealed container beside the first, something hot inside, smelling faintly of the secondary sweet note from before. He drank it in the dark and thought about the look on Saravin's face, and the guards she'd positioned close enough to respond in 30 seconds, and the thing he'd seen in her eyes that he still didn't have a Valkyrie word for. Morning arrived not as light from outside was space, with its own light and its own complete indifference, but as a brightening of the corridor visible under the cell door, a shift in air recycling, a change in background hum from maintenance to operational, the particular acoustic signature of a ship waking up. The door opened. His guardian stood there. "The princess will receive you," the guardian said. Webb stood. He straightened what could be straightened in his uniform, which wasn't much. He walked through the door. He had survived the night. He wondered, not for the last time, what that was going to cost him. The room Saravin took him to that morning was not the throne chamber. It was smaller, functional rather than ceremonial surfaces covered in data displays, organized around real-time sensor feeds, and a star chart spanning an entire wall that he needed several seconds to orient around. The Kepler system, his system, the debris field where the station had been. The Valkyrie were tracking it with a sensor net detailed enough to probably catalog individual structural fragments. They had been watching it since the beginning, maybe before. Saravin was standing at the star chart with her back to him when he entered. She didn't turn immediately. He waited. After 15 seconds she turned. "You survived the night," she said. "I noticed," Webb said. "The individual responsible has been removed from duty pending formal review." She said it with the same even tone she used for everything. But there was something underneath it this time, a controlled quality, the particular stillness of someone maintaining a grip on a reaction rather than not having one. "What happened was not authorized." "Whose authorization are we talking about?" "Mine," she said. "Nothing of that kind was authorized by me." "High Counselor Veth?" Webb said. Her four eyes tracked him with a precision he was starting to recognize as a tell the Valkyrie equivalent of going very still.
"You know his name. Someone addressed him by it in the throne chamber. I have good ears."
A pause. "Was it him?" "The investigation is ongoing," she said, which was a way of saying yes while retaining the right to say no later. He looked at the star chart, at what remained of Kepler Station, which the Valkyrie were tracking as if it still mattered. "You said you'd explain what the Kaveth Narum is," he said. She moved to one of the display surfaces and brought up a document Valkyrie text, which he couldn't read, but she was evidently reading it from memory rather than from the screen. "The Kaveth Narum," she said, "is the highest form of alliance that the Valkyrie Imperium can establish. It is offered between equals. Only between equals." A pause. "It has never, in the history of the Imperium, been offered to anyone outside the Valkyrie species." Webb processed this carefully. "That explains why your court looked like they'd witnessed something fall out of the sky." "They were surprised," she confirmed, "as was I by your refusal." "You couldn't have predicted I'd refuse?" "I had calculated that your species' instinct for survival would override other considerations in that particular context," she said. "I was wrong." He looked at her. "What other considerations did you think would be overridden?" "Your pride," she said. "Your unwillingness to appear compliant in front of an enemy power. You thought I'd agree to something I didn't understand rather than look weak." "I thought you might," she said. "I was wrong." "What do you actually want from me?" he said. The silence that followed was longer than the ones before. Something was happening in it, not calculation. More like a decision being approached from multiple angles before being committed to. He waited. He'd gotten better at waiting. In the last 24 hours, though waiting had never been the part of his skill set he'd most valued. "What I want from you is not simple to explain," she said, "and explaining it fully requires trust that neither of us has yet earned from the other. I will say this. The Kaveth Narum is not an act of possession. It is not dominion. It is a joining of perspectives, a ritual that requires both participants to make themselves fully known to the other. It can only be completed voluntarily by those who understand what they are agreeing to." She looked at him steadily. "You could not have agreed to it. You didn't understand it. Refusing was the only appropriate response to an offer you didn't understand. Then why offer it when you knew I wouldn't understand?" She turned back to the star chart. "Because I needed to see what you would do when offered something you didn't understand. Whether you would refuse, comply, or ask for time." She was quiet for a moment. "What you did was none of those things," I argued, Webb said. "You argued," she confirmed, "in front of my full court, with full knowledge of the penalty for refusal, with logic and explicit dignity and a direct request to have your reasons formally recorded." She didn't look at him when she said it. "I have studied every human contact record in our database. I was not prepared for that. He looked at the debris field of Kepler Station and thought about Chen, about what it meant that the enemy had been studying them this closely and still hadn't predicted what one of them would do when cornered. "What are you actually trying to accomplish?" he said. "I am trying to stop a war," she said. She said it the way someone says something true they haven't said out loud before, with the particular flatness of a thing being tested against air for the first time. Not this war, necessarily. A larger one. One that neither of our species is fully aware we are already losing. Before he could respond, a tone sounded somewhere in the room, brief, high, specific, and her attention shifted in the complete, instantaneous way of someone receiving a priority signal. She said something in Valkyrie to a comm panel, and then looked at him. "We will continue this," Shaw said. "For now you will be taken to a section of the ship where you may move within certain limits. You are not a prisoner in the traditional sense. You are a guest with security constraints. The constraints protect both of us. One of your people tried to kill me last night," Webb said. "Yes," she said, "which is why you will have 2 guardians at all times, and why the section you'll access doesn't include anything of direct strategic value." A pause, or so we have calculated. She was almost smiling. He was almost certain of it. He was given access to the Varanthi's 3rd level, an observation deck, a research library organized by Valkyrie logic that took him half a day to parse and another half to appreciate, and a space for physical movement that was sized with the same unsettling precision for a human body rather than a Valkyrie one. He spent 4 days in it. He observed, he cataloged, he filed. The first day he spent mapping the space he'd been given. Not physically, he wasn't going to pace the corners like a man counting a cell, because that was what you did when you were trying to establish limits. And the thing about limits was that knowing them too precisely was sometimes less valuable than knowing them approximately from a position of apparent comfort. He moved through the space with the quality of a person who had nowhere to be, which had the secondary benefit of being true. The observation deck looked out on a section of open space that the Varanthi was currently crossing at a velocity he couldn't precisely calculate without instruments. Stars were stars without specific reference points. The view told him more about the psychological design of the Varanthi than about navigation. Someone had decided that the people aboard this ship should have access to the view of what they were moving through. That was a choice with implications about values. The research library took him 2.5 days to parse. The Valkyrie organized knowledge differently from humans, not by subject in the sense of grouped content, but by something closer to context of use, the situations in which a particular type of information would be needed rather than the information's own categorical identity. It was a less intuitive system for someone raised in a different tradition, and a more practical one, and he spent most of that time annoyed at it, and the rest of the time grudgingly impressed. He ate when food appeared. He slept in intervals. He cataloged. The food improved over the 4 days, incrementally, as whoever was responsible for supplying it apparently cross-referenced human nutritional data and made adjustments. This told him the Valkyrie were capable of real-time adaptation and cared about getting the variables right. It also told him that Sarah had assigned someone to the problem of keeping him functional, which was a resource expenditure that had to be justified somewhere in her command structure. He was being valued. He wasn't certain what that meant for him yet, but it went in the file. The Varanthi was a warship, but it was also something else, something that operated in the gap between military and administrative authority in a way that didn't have a clean human equivalent. Saravin's role aboard it wasn't simply that of a commander. She was something like a sovereign court made portable, a center of institutional power that made decisions binding on the Imperium from wherever she happened to be. The crew understood this. The way they moved around her had the quality not of military discipline, but of the particular gravity of people operating close to genuine power. High Counselor Veth operated differently, institutional rather than personal authority, the kind that comes from understanding this machinery of a system better than almost anyone else and using that knowledge as leverage. He was not Saravin's subordinate, the way her guardians were. He was more like a counterweight, something the Imperium structure had placed there, to prevent the kind of overreach that putting a royal person in command of an arm's worth of military power might otherwise produce. Webb watched Veth watch Saravin, and he watched how Veth watched him, not with straightforward hostility, though that was present, but with something more precise. Watching what the human was paying attention to. Watching what the human was building. On the third day, Veth walked through the research library while Webb was there. He didn't speak. He walked through with the quality of a person who has legitimate business in a space and is therefore above notice, and he did this while running his amber eyes over exactly what Webb was accessing, which told Webb two things. First, that Veth was fully aware of the research library's indexing system and could read precisely what material Webb had been in, and second, that Veth wanted Webb to know he was aware. It was a message. The message was, I am watching you construct whatever you are constructing, and I want you to factor that into your construction. Webb filed that too. What he kept coming back to in the hours between sleep and cataloging was the question of what he was supposed to do with what Saravin had told him. About the Vekai, about the falsified sensor data, about the Concordance Council, and the evidence that had been blocked 7 times, and the blocked attempts that each had the fingerprints of someone who understood the Council's internal timing well enough to intervene before things reached a vote. He was a staff sergeant of the Earth Defense Forces. He had a duty to his people and to his command and to the EDF's mission in this conflict. He also had 11 people who had died in this conflict because of what someone else had manufactured. Those two facts sat in different parts of his chest, and they weren't as compatible as they might have been. The thing about duty, in Webb's experience, was that it was clearest when the situation was clearest, when the enemy was unambiguous, when the people you were protecting were behind you, the threat was in front of you, and the thing to do was to hold the line. He'd spent his career being good at that kind of duty. He was less practiced at the kind that required you to sit in a library on an enemy flagship and decide what the right thing to do was when the enemy had just told you something that made the entire conflict look different. He thought about Chen, about 12 hours, about the specific quality of the choice to keep holding when the math said otherwise. He thought about what Saravin had said, that she'd studied every human contact record in their database, that she'd reviewed his tactical decisions, that she'd watched his unit hold Kepler Station. Not because she was building a case against him, but because she was trying to understand what the people in those records were made of, what they chose when the choosing was hard. He wasn't sure what he was made of right now. He was pretty sure he was about to find out. Webb was building a picture of the ship's communication architecture. He was doing it carefully, one piece at a time, because he was a soldier of the Earth Defense Forces, and he had a duty to his people, and to the 11 people who weren't here anymore. And because Saravin had given him access to a section of the ship she thought didn't include anything strategically significant. She was right about most of it. She was wrong about the relay station in the environmental maintenance corridor running along the outer hull of the 3rd level. It had been built there because
environmental maintenance corridors run along the outer hull of any ship using a specific type of heat exchange system, and relay stations exist in those corridors.
Because that's where the physical communication lines run, and Saravin's security team had overlooked it because it wasn't a communication station in the operational sense. It was a physical junction point, the kind of infrastructure that exists everywhere and gets mapped carefully only by people who understand ship architecture at the hardware level. Webb understood ship architecture at the hardware level. 3 years stationed aboard the ESS Meridian before his ground deployment. He knew what a junction relay looked like. He'd spent the 4th day working out exactly what he needed and how to access it, not in any way that would register as planning, not the visible kind of stillness that came from focusing, not anything that would show up in the behavioral analysis that Veth's people were clearly running on everything he did. He thought about it the way he thought about all the things he was filing, in the background, while his attention was visibly somewhere else. What he needed was navigation data. If he could get to the secondary communications relay and pull the navigation records, he could establish the Varanthi's current position and likely course. He couldn't transmit that information. Anywhere he had no transmitter, his implant's comm functions were too short-range to reach any useful, but knowing it would change his options if he found a way off the ship that he hadn't identified yet. And giving Earth that data if he ever got back would be worth something. It would be worth the risk. He was aware that this logic was thinner than he was used to. He was aware that the real reason was simpler. He had a duty, and the duty said that as long as he was alive and in a position to gather intelligence, he should gather it. It was what Chen would have done. It was what any of the 11 would have done. You kept doing the next thing that needed doing until there was no next thing left. He wasn't dead yet. On the evening of the 4th day, after his guardians had settled into the particular quality of attention that meant they were present but not on alert, he told them he was going to the environmental maintenance corridor because the observation deck was showing stars he couldn't identify, and he wanted to cross-reference with a navigation display running off the maintenance systems. This was true. He genuinely wanted to do that. He was also going to do something else while he was there. The relay station was in the 3rd junction of the maintenance corridor, behind a panel secured with a physical latch. Valthyri ships used physical latches on maintenance panels because electronic locks failed in specific interference scenarios and you always had fallback systems. He opened the latch without difficulty because a physical latch is a physical latch regardless of which species designed it, and he dealt with maintenance panels on 3 different ship classes. The relay hardware inside was Valthyri design. He'd studied enough captured equipment schematics to orient himself. Standard navigation data would be in one of the optical relay channels, compressed and encrypted with Valthyri military encryption that EDF cryptographic teams had been working on for 18 months with partial success. What was in the first channel he accessed was not standard navigation data. He almost missed it. It looked like a noise artifact at first, a frequency that didn't belong. Cycling through the relay stack in a pattern that was slightly too regular to be random, and slightly too irregular to match any Valthyri transmission protocol he'd encountered. He stared at it for 30 seconds, then ran the signal analysis his implant was capable of. Limited, a soldier's kit rather than a technician's, but adequate for basic pattern recognition. The pattern resolved into something he recognized before he'd identified what he was looking at. An encrypted handshake, a check-in signal, the kind of thing a communication device transmits periodically to verify its destination is still listening. But the destination wasn't Valthyri. The protocol stack was wrong. The addressing was wrong. The frequency signature was wrong in a way that was specific rather than random wrong. In the particular way a signal is wrong, when it's been designed by people who know what the standard looks like and want to appear similar without being identical. Webb was still staring at it, trying to identify exactly what he was looking at, when 3 things happened in rapid succession. His implant flagged the signal with a warning code he'd been briefed on, but never personally encountered: unknown protocol, potential third-party origin, non-standard galactic signal. Whatever he'd done to access the channel triggered a security cascade in the relay stack. Because this channel had a detection flag on it, someone had flagged this specific signal for monitoring, and accessing it had tripped the flag. The security cascade triggered an immediate alert to Saravin's guardians, who arrived at his position in approximately 90 seconds, fast enough to suggest they had not been as far away as he'd calculated. The panel was re-secured. Webb was moved from the corridor firmly, not harshly, and walked back through the ship at slightly more than normal pace. He had time to note, in the part of his brain still cataloging, that Saravin was already in the corridor when they arrived, not summoned by the alert. Already there, which meant she'd been close, which meant she'd been watching. She looked at him, then at the access panel, then at him again. "What did you find?" she said. "A signal that doesn't match any Valthyri protocol I've studied," he said. "Cycling through your relay stack, with a handshake pattern that suggests it's checking in with a remote destination on a regular schedule." The bioluminescent patterns on Saravin's face did something he hadn't seen them do before. They went through a rapid sequence, several colors in fast succession, none of them stable, and then settled into a pale, cold silver that he was starting to recognize as the state she entered when something demanded her full, concentrated attention. She stepped past him to the open panel and looked at the relay display. She was still for a long moment. Then she said 2 words in Valthyri that the translation unit didn't render. They were names rather than statements, he thought. Something functioning as profanity or invocation, and straightened. She looked at him. "You broke into exactly the right place," she said. The lights in the maintenance corridor flickered. A small thing, but it was followed. A moment later, by an alert tone from somewhere in the ship's systems, not the security alert from before, a different register entirely. Not the Varanthi responding to an intrusion. Something else responding to the intrusion. Something responding from a long way away. Saravan was already moving before the tone finished sounding. She issued orders in Valthyri, rapid, flat, the cadence of someone who has identified a threat and is directing the response to it, and looked at Webb over her shoulder. "Stay close," she said. "They know something looked at their signal. We have perhaps 10 minutes before they decide the look was deliberate." "Who's they?" Webb said. She was already walking. The long Valthyri stride ate distance quickly. "Come," she said. He came. The secure situation room Saravan took him to was 3 levels above his holding. Area doors thicker, access protocols more layered, the air with the slight overpressure of a space that sealed well and sealed often. She pulled the signal up on different display hardware here, running it through analysis tools that made his implant look like a children's toy. He watched over her shoulder as the data resolved. "The Vekai Consortium," she said. She said it in English, which told him she wanted him to understand rather than translating after the fact. "A trading consortium that operates through the margins of concordant space. Officially neutral in all conflicts. Officially committed to free information exchange and open trade routes." She highlighted something: the signal.
Data.
They have had presence in Valthyri communications infrastructure for approximately 14 months. 14 months, Webb said. "The war started 18 months ago." "Yes," she said. "They were already inside your system 4 months before the war started." "Before the incident that started the war," she corrected. "Yes." "What was the incident?" The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. Heavier. "A Valthyri patrol vessel intercepted a human survey craft in disputed space," she said. The interaction escalated. Weapons were fired. Both vessels were destroyed. She paused. "This was the opening incident of this conflict." "I know," Webb said. "The Herschel." "And the Vera 7, she said. "Our vessel?" "Yes." She looked at the signal data without looking at anything. "We have subsequently determined that neither crew initiated the engagement. Both crews issued hostility advisories to the opposing vessel simultaneously. Both crews appear to have received false sensor data, indicating the other vessel had already opened fire." Webb was very still. "Both vessels received false data," he said. "Simultaneously," she said, "which requires either an extraordinary coincidence of simultaneous sensor malfunction across 2 different ships, or an external actor capable of falsifying sensor data on 2 different vessels simultaneously from a position close enough to manage the timing. Someone started the war. Someone ensured the war could not avoid starting," she said. "There is a difference. They did not create the existing tension between our species. They found a moment of existing tension and removed the possibility of de-escalation." Webb sat down on the nearest surface of Valthyri work seat sized for someone substantially taller, but he sat on it anyway. He sat on it because he needed to be sitting, and there was nothing else. He looked at the signal display, at the thing he'd found in the relay junction, and he thought about the specific quality of what she'd just told him. Both crews, both vessels, falsified data on 2 ships at once, timed closely enough to ensure that the hostility advisories each crew received would reflect the other crew already having opened fire. Not an accident, not a misunderstanding, a moment of tension that had been very precisely turned into a moment of no return. "Why?" he said. "The Vekai Consortium operates on the margins of galactic space," she said. "Margins are valuable when there are 2 major powers on either side of them that are not trading with each other. Conflict creates dependency on neutral parties. It opens markets. It creates demand for intermediary services." A pause. "They have been doing this for at least 200 years, to at least 6 different species, across 4 documented conflicts. We found the pattern 11 months ago. 11 months ago," Webb said. 8 months into the war. 8 months in," she confirmed. "When I had enough evidence to bring to the Concordance Council and request an emergency review." She looked at the signal with an expression he was starting to read as the Valthyri version of disgust. The review was blocked. The filing was flagged as procedurally defective. 3 Concordance officials, whose votes I needed to advance the review, were found to have financial relationships with Vekai's trading entities. "They're inside the Concordance," Webb said. "They have been inside the Concordance for a very long time," she said. "They are patient. They understand that the most valuable position in any conflict is the one from which you cannot be accused of participating in it. And they've been in your communications infrastructure for 14 months, Webb said. Monitoring, looking for their moment. Monitoring our command decisions, she said. Our military posture. The moments when we were most likely to be in close contact with human vessels in disputed space. They did not need to manufacture the entire situation. They needed only to be present at the right moment with the right tool. She looked at the signal display. The falsification required close proximity to both vessels within sensor manipulation range, which is not long. They must have staged a vessel in the disputed zone in advance, before the patrol, waiting. That level of preparation requires resources, intelligence, and patience. It is consistent with what we know of their methods. He thought about the Kveth Narum, about the reaction of her court, about an alien princess approaching a captured human soldier, not for any of the reasons he'd assumed. You need a human, he said, working through it slowly. Someone who can stand in front of the concordance and say the Valkyrie brought them this information, that it wasn't fabricated, that they came voluntarily, as an equal participant, not as a captive or a coerced subject. She looked at him steadily. If a human completed the Kveth Narum with you, he said, if someone completed that ritual, they'd have Valkyrie diplomatic standing with the concordance. They couldn't be dismissed as a prisoner testifying under duress. A participant in the Kveth Narum is a formal ally of the Imperium, she said, with full concordance standing to bring testimony before the council. Yes, and if you brought me to the council as a prisoner, they could dismiss everything. They could dismiss it on procedural grounds that no concordance court could overturn in time to prevent the war from reaching a point of no return, she said. Yes, you needed me to volunteer. I needed someone who would refuse if they felt they were being coerced, she said, and who would understand, once they were not being coerced, why it mattered. She looked at him directly. I calculated that a soldier who had held a station for 71 hours against 4-to-1 odds in defense of a population that was already evacuated. A population he knew was already evacuated would have a particular relationship with the concept of choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. Webb went completely still. He knew, he said. Your Sergeant Major Chen knew the civilian evacuation was complete approximately 12 hours before the engagement ended, she said. We have his communications. He chose to continue holding the station to protect the evacuation routes rather than ordering the retreat that would have saved his unit. To protect routes that were already clear, Webb said. The routes were clear, she said. The station held anyway, for 12 more hours, at the cost of 12 lives. She was quiet for a moment. I do not think the Valkyrie concept of duty maps cleanly onto what I read in those records, but I understand the shape of it. The choice to continue holding a position past the point where it can be calculated as rational. The choice to be the thing between harm and the people behind you, even when the people behind you are already safe. He never told us, Webb said. No, she said. He sat with that. The Kveth Narum. Tell me what it actually is. It is an act of mutual transparency, she said. Participants share with each other the things they are most reluctant to share. Not secrets in the tactical sense, not information that transfers military advantage. The things that shaped the person, the decisions they are least at peace with, the fears they carry forward, the losses they haven't fully accounted for. She looked at him. It was designed for this exact situation. For moments when two parties must trust each other without having yet earned that trust, and the stakes are high enough that there is no time to earn it the slow way. And after the ritual, they have standing with the concordance. After the ritual, they have standing. And they have evidence of good faith that the concordance's own protocols require it to honor. She looked at the signal data. Assuming we can reach the council before the Vekai agents within it manage to prevent our arrival. Webb opened his mouth. The lights went out. In the 4 seconds of total darkness before emergency illumination engaged, he reached one clear conclusion. This was not a systems failure. This was deliberate. Someone aboard the Varanthe had cut power to this section, with full knowledge of where Saravan was, which meant either a directional listening device or someone with access to the ship's internal sensor network. When the emergency illumination came up, red backup, giving the room the look of something burning, Saravan was already moving. She crossed to a wall panel, produced a communication device from inside it, activated it with a sequence of touches, pressed it to her ear. The door opened. The person who came through it was not one of her guardians. Webb was already moving when the weapon came up. Not toward the door and not away toward Saravan, because the angle of the weapon's targeting sweep told him exactly what the intention was. He got between her and the door in approximately 2 seconds, which was 1 second more than he'd have preferred, and the weapon discharged into the wall behind him rather than into her. The sound was wrong for sharper, narrower, something designed for targeted elimination rather than combat, a tool for making one death look specific rather than tactical. He and Saravan were behind the nearest workstation when the door opened a second time and her guardians came through, and the situation was resolved with the precision and economy of people who were very good at their work. The silence after was different from all the previous silences. It was the silence of a room that has just hosted violence and is still calibrating back to normal. The way a tuning fork still vibrates for a while after you've stopped striking it. The shooter, the second shooter. This was a coordinated attempt. Someone inside the ship working from the same intelligence that had sent the man with the cutting tool to Webb's cell was a young Valkyrie in what appeared to be standard crew attire, the kind that didn't stand out in any corridor on the ship. The Guardians were professional about it. They checked for additional weapons, confirmed there were no others, and physically removed the individual from the room with the quiet efficiency of people who had been trained for exactly this and had hoped not to need the training. The door sealed behind them. Webb became aware that his hands were shaking. He became aware of it the way you become aware of things after the crisis has passed, when your body begins asking for information about what just happened. He pressed his palms flat against the floor and looked at them until they stopped. Saravan was looking at him. She had the particular quality of attention of someone who has just watched something happen that they did not predict and is now rapidly updating their model. "You moved between me and the weapon," she said. "Yeah," he said. "That was not strategically optimal for your survival." "No," he agreed. He thought about trying to explain it and decided against it. There wasn't an explanation exactly. There was just the thing where someone pointed a weapon at someone near you, and there was a move, and either you made it or you didn't. He'd spent 12 years making it. "No," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, all 4 amber eyes. The frostglass patterns on her cheekbones were cycling in a rhythm he hadn't seen before, slow, deep, deliberate. Something he'd catalog later when the adrenaline finished clearing. "The Vekai have access to the Varanthi's internal sensor network," she said. "They knew where we were." "Which means your command infrastructure is compromised," Webb said. "Yes, which means you can't trust your own ship." "No." "Then we need somewhere to talk that their sensors can't see." He looked at her. "Where does that leave us?" She was quiet for a moment. "Then, my private quarters. The one section of the ship with electromagnetic shielding I authorized personally, without routing through the command systems. Nothing that happens there is visible to the sensor network." "Show me," he said. The private quarters of the heir to the Valkyrie Imperium were not what Webb had expected. They were smaller than the Situation Room. For one thing, more intimate in the way that the spaces people actually in are always more intimate than the spaces they perform authority in. The walls were covered in something that functioned as data storage, but presented as a continuous field of soft light, and within that light, in 3 dimensions, arranged with the deliberate care of something deeply personal, were faces. Not quite faces. Valkyrie weren't quite faces in the human sense, but the bioluminescent patterns, the specific, complex, individual patterns of individuals, each one different from every other, each rendered in the frozen precision of a recording taken at a specific moment. There were approximately 40 of them, and there was no bed. Webb genuinely looked, because it suddenly mattered to him to understand what he was actually seeing. The surfaces were organized around a low central space with the quality of something meditative rather than ergonomic, the Valkyrie version of something between a floor and furniture. Display systems, communication arrays, several of which he noted were isolated, not connected to the ship's main network. An armored storage case, a small alcove that held something he couldn't identify, no equivalent of a bed, no space that suggested anything like what he'd constructed in his mind when the translation had produced "Share My Chamber." He looked at the wall of bioluminescent patterns. Most were clearly Valkyrie, some fewer, but there were different shapes, different structures. Patterns from species he didn't recognize. These are the others, he said. Not a question. The others who have completed the Kethnarum with me, she said.
Over. Time.
A high commander of the Keth Expanse when I was 18, and a diplomatic crisis had no other resolution. A merchant admiral of the Surai Collective, when the trade corridors needed a different kind of bond than contracts could provide. She paused. They are all dead now. All of them. Some in this war, some in other circumstances. The ritual does not make someone invulnerable. It makes them known. It makes them matter. In a specific way. Webb looked at the patterns on the wall and thought about what she'd said about Chen. About 12 more hours. About holding a position past the point where it could be calculated as rational. He looked at the pattern he didn't recognize, not Valthyri. Something from another species entirely, smaller and structured differently. The rings of it tight toward the center, like something drawing inward. Someone had been important enough to this room to be here, and important enough to keep being here after they were gone. He thought about what that meant. To matter in a specific way. Not to be known abstractly. Not to be a name in a record or a subject in a tactical analysis. But to be known the way the Kethnarum apparently made you known, the particular weight you carried, the decisions that had made you the specific person you were. He didn't have a great deal of experience with that kind of being known. 12 years of operational service had made him efficient at performing whatever version of himself a situation required, and considerably less practiced at the version of himself he was when the situation required nothing at all. He'd spent a career being the thing between harm and the people behind him, and that was a role that didn't leave a lot of room for the question of what you were when you weren't the thing between harm and anything. He looked at the dead alien's pattern and thought about whether he wanted to end up on this wall, known in that specific way. After enough time had passed for it to matter, after the thing you'd chosen to do had become part of what you were, woven in, inseparable. He thought he probably did. I've been understanding this wrong from the beginning, he said. Yes, she said. I came in here thinking you were trying to claim me, thinking this was a power move, a way of categorizing humans as something that could be owned by someone of your rank. Yes, she said again. And all of this time, she said, quietly, I was trying to ask if you would trust me, in the only form I know how to ask for trust. And you said no, because you didn't know what I was asking. And I didn't explain, because in my culture, explaining the Kethnarum to someone who has refused it is, she paused, searching for the English construction. It is like explaining a gift to someone who has thrown it at you. The explanation changes what the gift was. The gift is me saying yes because I actually understand it, he said. The gift is you making a choice that could not be coerced, she said. Because a coerced Kethnarum is not a Kethnarum. It is theater. And theater does not produce concordance standing. Webb looked at the wall of patterns for a long moment. He thought about the decision he'd been carrying since Kepler Station, the one he'd never said out loud, the one where he'd run the overload sequence instead of staying at the junction with Chen, the thing he'd never fully decided whether it was smart or cowardly, the weight of it that he'd been filing under, figure out later because later never arrived. I want to say yes, he said. I want to tell you I understand what that means, but I want you to understand what you'd be asking of me. Tell me, she said. He took a breath. Kepler Station. The reason I'm the only survivor. I need to tell you what happened at the end, and what I chose to do, and what I've never been able to decide about whether it was right. And then you need to tell me something equivalent. And then we decide. She turned to look at the wall of patterns. She was quiet for a long moment. What I would share with you, she said finally, includes the decision that began this war. The patrol that intercepted the human survey ship. I gave the order for that patrol to investigate that region of disputed space. Her voice was very flat, the flatness of something being said that has been held in for a long time. I did not give the order to engage. But my order created the situation that the Vakai weaponized. I have not said this publicly. If it became known, my ability to lead the case against the Vakai would be compromised. They would reframe everything as the Imperium avoiding accountability for starting the war. But it's the truth, Webb said. It is part of the truth, she said. The Vakai manipulated the outcome. They falsified the sensor data. But I gave the order that created the opportunity for them to manipulate. She looked back at him. In the ritual, you would know this, and you would have to decide what to do with it. He was quiet for a while. We're going to have to tell the concordance, he said. Both of us, all of it, or the case doesn't hold. I know, she said. All right, he said. All right, she said. I said I want to understand things before I agree to them, he said. I understand this. I want to complete the Kveth Narum, Princess Saravan, when we get to the Concordance Council. But we have to get there first. And right now your ship is compromised and someone just tried to shoot you in your own situation room. So let's solve the problems in order. She looked at him with all four eyes, and the frost glass patterns on her cheekbones shifted to something that he thought, with more confidence than he'd had about any of his previous interpretations, was a very specific kind of relief. Agreed, she said. Then we plan, he said. The journey to the Concordance Council station took 2 days. Saravan spent most of it isolating and removing the Vekai signal access from the Varanthes sensor network, pulling 3 secondary relay systems entirely offline, rebuilding the access protocols from stored backups that predated the Vekai penetration. High Counselor Veth spent most of it formally objecting to the direction of their transit through every official channel available to him, which were numerous and all of them exactly as effective as shouting into a vacuum. Webb spent most of it in Saravan's shielded quarters, going through the Concordance Council's procedural protocols documents she'd had translated and archived. Everything publicly available about how testimony was presented, what standing was required, what the Vekai agents inside the council had used to block her previous 7 attempts. He was building a picture. He was good at building pictures. On the first day, he went through the procedural rules. The Concordance operated on a system of precedent and exception that was more similar to common law than to the code-based systems he'd expected from an alien institution, which made it slower and more interpretable, which in turn made it both easier to navigate and easier to abuse. The abuse channels were what interested him. Specifically, what the abuse channels looked like from the outside when they were being used by someone who knew how to disguise them as legitimate procedure. On the second day, he went through the blocking records, all 7 of them, laid out in the translation-accessible format that Saravan's archivists had prepared. He went through them the way he'd gone through enemy tactical records during his training, not looking for the obvious, but looking for the negative space, the shape of what wasn't there, the decisions that weren't made, the arguments that weren't tried, the moments where a different approach might have worked, but someone with the right information had steered things away from it before it could be tested. By the end of the second day, he had 4 names. The Concordance Council station occupied a Lagrange point in a system with no inhabited planets, which was either very clever from a neutrality standpoint or very convenient for people who needed to conduct business without witnesses, depending on how you looked at it. It was enormous, a structure built by collective galactic commitment rather than any single species. 8 generations of expansion and addition in every direction accumulated the way significance accumulates when it has nowhere to go but outward. Webb saw it through the observation port of the Varanthe and thought about the United Nations building in Manhattan, which was small and underfunded and perpetually behind on its member dues, and still, somehow, the most important real estate on the planet. He thought about what was inside this place and whether importance scaled with size or only with what people were willing to believe about it. They docked without incident. Saravan had filed their arrival through the correct diplomatic channels 2 days in advance, in a way that was legally unimpeachable and practically very difficult to block the kind of filing that produces an obligation to receive rather than an invitation to accept. The council chamber was designed to accommodate the full range of concordant species, which meant it was designed to accommodate nobody entirely well. Seating adjustable, atmosphere a compromise, lighting a negotiated average. It held 11 species in various configurations, with representatives present from 18 member states. Webb sat in the human diplomatic seat. There was a human diplomatic seat, had been since first contact 14 months ago, though it had been empty for 12 of those months because the human diplomatic mission had been suspended due to the war, and looked at the chamber and tried to identify the Vekai. He'd been doing this for 2 days, building a profile not from physical appearance the Vekai looked. In the briefing files Saravan had given him access to, like a species that had developed to be visually unremarkable in the way some predators develop to be unremarkable. An evolutionary argument for the survival value of looking exactly like what you'd expect to see. They could pass for 3 or 4 different concordant species under casual observation. Not from appearance, then, from behavior. He'd spent the 2 days in transit going through the procedural records of Saravin's previous attempts. Every attempt blocked on a procedural ground, every single one. He'd mapped the voting patterns, the procedural challenges, the species affiliations of the officials who'd raised the objections. And he'd noticed something that the Valtheri analysts, who were very good at processing data, hadn't quite caught. The pattern wasn't in the votes. It was in the timing. Every procedural challenge had been raised in the window between when Saravin's filing was submitted and when it reached the floor. Not after it reached the floor, where it would have been voted down in a way that created a record. Before it reached the floor, when a block looked like routine administrative management rather than deliberate interference. Someone who understood the council's timing architecture extremely well. Someone who'd been working inside it long enough to know not just the rules, but the rhythms when information moved, how it moved, where the gaps were. Someone who, looking at the record, had been serving in some capacity on the council for at least 11 years. Long enough to be furniture, long enough to be assumed, long enough that your name appeared on documents without anyone examining it closely. He had 4 candidates. They had something in common beyond the obvious. All 4 were long tenured. All 4 had a record of what would read as procedural conservatism. The kind of caution that looked like institutional wisdom rather than interference.
And all 4 had specific patterns of intervention on Vecai-adjacent issues that were consistent enough to register, but distributed enough over time that they'd never triggered the pattern recognition threshold
that Saravin's analysts had been running. The Valtheri analysts were very good at processing data. They were excellent at identifying anomalies once they knew what they were looking for. What they were less practiced at was the specific kind of pattern recognition that came from spending years in rooms with people who were trying to hide something, watching what happened to a face when the thing it was hiding got close enough to be a problem. That was not a skill that came from processing records. It came from experience. Webb had a great deal of it. By the time they docked, he'd gotten it down to 2, based on cross-referencing presence at all 7 previous blocking events, with access to the specific filing windows where each block had been inserted. One of his 2 remaining candidates hadn't had that level of access to the first 3 blocks, which left 1. By the time they were seated in the chamber watching the opening protocols, he'd gotten it to 1. The Sarai representative, 3rd seat, who went by the designation Executor Prail, had served on the council for 14 years. Trade Standards Committee, Border Adjudication Panel, Neutral Passage Authority. A record of even-handed voting on most issues, and a specific, consistent pattern of administrative intervention on issues touching Vecai activities always frames procedural precision rather than substantive objection, always finding the specific rule that applied rather than inventing one. Clean every time. The kind of clean that comes from experience rather than innocence. Webb watched Executor Prail watch Saravin begin her presentation, and he saw the thing that no algorithmic analysis had caught, because algorithmic analysis processed data and pattern and probability, and what Webb was watching existed before any of those things. The particular quality of attention that a face pays to something it knows is a problem, and is actively deciding how to handle. The specific texture of someone managing more information than they're supposed to have. He leaned toward the Valtheri aide assigned to the human diplomatic seat and said, quietly, "I need to pass a message to the princess," without going through the standard communication infrastructure. The aide looked at him. "I can pass a note," she said, in a tone that suggested this was possibly beneath the dignity of a council session. "That'll do," he said. What he wrote was a single line. Executor Prail, 3rd seat, Sarai representative. Watch the timing of any procedural challenge. Asked to see his travel records for the last 14 years. He watched Saravin read it without looking at him. He watched the frost glass patterns on her face go through a rapid controlled sequence. She turned to one of her advisors and said something very quietly. The Vecai made their move 12 minutes later. They made it through Executor Prail, who raised a procedural challenge at the exact moment Saravin's censor, data falsification evidence, was about to be entered into the formal record, the specific kind of challenge that required resolution before the evidence could proceed. A question about chain of custody, reasonable sounding, technical. The kind of challenge that would consume 3 committee sessions to resolve and would bleed the momentum of the hearing while the clock ran. Saravin looked at Webb. He stood up. Point of clarification, he said, in English, because he'd confirmed with the aide earlier that simultaneous translation was running. I'd like to address the chain of custody question. Executor Prail turned to look at him. The quality of that look, a face trying to remain neutral, working slightly too hard at it, was the confirmation Webb had been waiting for. Chain of custody requires documentation of where evidence originated, how it was acquired, and whether the acquiring party had standing to acquire it, Webb said. I'm the chain of custody. I found this signal in the communications relay of the Valthyri flagship Varanthi on the 4th day of my detention aboard that vessel, during unauthorized access to a maintenance relay junction, which I'll fully acknowledge. I triggered a security alert doing it.
The princess and I observed it simultaneously. I am Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb of the Earth Defense Forces, present in this chamber. As a voluntary participant in proceedings, I was transported here to attend.
I have first-hand knowledge of the discovery of the evidence, and I will swear to all of it in whatever form this council's protocols require. He looked at Executor Prail. Does that address the chain of custody question? The chamber was very quiet. The witnesses standing in this proceeding has not been formally established, Prail said, in a voice that was precisely controlled. Then let's establish it, Webb said. Under Concordance Rule 14, Section 7, a participant in a recognized diplomatic ritual of any concordance member species has standing as a diplomatic representative of that species. He'd spent 2 days reading procedural rules. 2 days had been enough. I'd like to formally indicate my intention to complete the Kaveth Narum with Princess Saravin Valthari, here, in this chamber, before this council in order to establish that standing. The murmur in the chamber was controlled but unmistakable. The Kaveth Narum is a private ritual, Executor Prail said. Rule 14.
Section 7 doesn't specify private or public, Webb said.
It specifies completion.
Completion can happen anywhere.
And if it happens during a Concordance Council session already on the record, there's no chain of custody problem with the standing it produces. He looked at Saravin. Your Highness, if you're willing. Saravin looked at him across the chamber. The frostglass patterns on her cheekbones were very still, very precise, the cold silver of concentrated attention. Then, slowly, something shifted in them, not the rapid cycling of stress or calculation. Something that moved more slowly, something that started near her temples and spread. I am willing, she said. What followed was the most difficult thing Webb had done in a career that had included a significant volume of things he'd never expected to do. Saravin stood in the center of the chamber. Webb came down from the human diplomatic seat and stood facing her. The chamber went quiet with a different quality than it had during the procedural exchanges, not the quiet of people paying close attention to an argument, but the quiet of people who understood they were witnessing something that didn't happen often. Representatives who'd been reviewing their own displays or conferring in low voices with aides stopped. The technical staff, visible through the side doors, stilled. Even the ambient system seemed to adjust, the standard hum of a working concordant station settling to something slightly lower. She explained the ritual to the chamber, the aide translating simultaneously in the same even tone she used for everything, without ornament or emphasis. Both participants share what they are most reluctant to share. Both must understand what they are agreeing to. Both must choose to continue at every step. There was no coercion possible. There was no ceremony. There were only 2 people, and the truth, and the choice to speak it. She stood in front of an alien she had captured by ordering his unit into a battle they'd had every reason to fight. And he stood in front of a princess who had been responsible for the situation that had killed 11 people he'd served beside. And the thing about what they were about to do was that those facts weren't going to go anywhere. They were going to be in the room with everything else they said. That was the point. That was the whole point. Webb understood that in a way he hadn't quite understood it before, standing there. The ritual wasn't asking them to pretend those things hadn't happened. It was asking them to be known completely, including by those things, to someone who might use what they knew and to choose to say yes to that anyway. That was what made it not coercion. That was what made it trust. She went first. He'd asked her to. She'd agreed without hesitation. The decision that created the conditions for this war was mine, she said, speaking to the chamber and to him simultaneously, her voice carrying both the subsonic authority of her position and something beneath it that was not authority at all. I ordered a patrol to investigate a region of disputed space where human survey activity had been detected. I had intelligence suggesting human survey operations in that region were expanding in a direction that would have created a territorial dispute within the year. I ordered the patrol to gather information. She paused. I did not order engagement. I did not anticipate engagement. But my order created an interaction at close range between two armed vessels in a disputed region during a period of diplomatic tension. The Vekai Consortium used that interaction. They falsified the sensor data of both vessels simultaneously and turned a tense standoff into an exchange of fire. Both crews died because of what I put in motion. Another pause, and this one was different, not the deliberate pause of a speaker controlling a room, but the brief pause of someone crossing a threshold they cannot cross back over. I have not said this publicly before. I am saying it now because a concordance case built on incomplete truth is not a case, it is an argument. And I am done arguing. The chamber was very quiet. Then Webb spoke. He had thought about how to say this. He had thought about it for 2 days, in Saravin's quarters, in the observation deck, in the brief intervals of sleep when he'd come up from under and found it waiting for him. He had thought about how to take the thing he'd never said out loud, not to his CO, not in any debrief, not to anyone, and make it into language that could be received by someone who wasn't human and didn't have the same concept of what it meant to be the last one out. In the end, there was only one way to say it, which was the true way. Kepler Station, he said. The final hours. When my unit was holding the primary junction, I ran the overload sequence on the secondary relay, rather than staying at the junction with my sergeant major. I have told myself it was a tactical decision. The sequence had to be run from the secondary relay, and there was no one else available to run it. That's true. Both of those things are true. He stopped. He started again. What else is true is that running the overload sequence meant being a kilometer from the junction when the junction was taken. It meant that when Chen and the others died, holding a position they'd chosen to hold, a position they held for 12 hours, past the point where the math said to leave. I wasn't there. I survived because I wasn't there. He looked at Saravin. I don't know if that was the right call. I have not stopped not knowing that since I came out the other side. That's what I carry. That's what I'm sharing. He stopped speaking. He'd said what there was to say, which was the whole thing, the complete thing, the version that didn't leave out the part where the decision was defensible and didn't leave out the part where it might not have been. He stood in the center of the Concordance Council chamber and felt the particular quality of being fully known to someone else, not comfortable, not uncomfortable exactly, just very specific, like being in direct sunlight rather than shade. More clearly defined. Saravin looked at him. The bioluminescent patterns on her face were cycling in the slow, deep rhythm he'd first seen in her quarters. The one he now understood was what she did when she was fully present, fully still, fully in the weight of something that mattered. Around them, the chamber was completely still. 31 species, 18 member states, and a thing that the Concordance had never documented before, a completed Kaveth Narum between a Valkyrie and a human, held in open session, fully witnessed, on the record. The kind of standing that could not be challenged on procedural grounds, because the procedure itself had just been completed in front of everyone who would need to certify it, with no intermediate steps, no gaps in the chain, no window for an administrative intervention before it reached the floor. I receive this, she said. It was formal part of the ritual, and you receive what I have shared. I receive it, he said. The Kaveth Narum is complete, she said. She raised her voice by exactly 1 degree to address the chamber. Under Concordance Rule 14, Section 7, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb of the Earth Defense Forces now holds standing as a diplomatic representative of the Valkyrie Imperium, as an equal partner of this alliance, and as a witness with full concordance, standing to the evidence we have presented. Executor Prail stood. His voice was very controlled. I moved to table the procedural question for committee review. The procedural question was chain of custody, Webb said. I've addressed chain of custody. I don't see the remaining basis for the motion. The witness's standing is itself under procedural challenge, Prail said. The witness's standing was established by a completed Kaveth Narum before this full council, Webb said, which is on the record, which cannot be unwitnessed. He looked at Prail directly at the Surai representative who had served on this council for 14 years, who had built a life inside the machinery of neutrality and used it with surgical precision to keep a war alive. You can challenge everything, but I'm going to ask this council to pull Executor Prail's travel records for the last 14 years, specifically his presence in any systems with documented Vekai trade operations. The pattern of how and when every one of the 7 previous challenges to Princess Saravin's filings was raised corresponds to knowledge of this council's internal timing architecture that takes years to acquire. And the question of who in this chamber has been here long enough to acquire that specific knowledge and what their relationship has been with Vekai-adjacent commercial interests is one this council should want answered before it proceeds with any further procedural motions. He stopped speaking. Execute Prail's face did the thing Webb had been watching for. Since they sat down, the microshift of a person who has been calculating outcomes and has just recalculated and doesn't like the new result. Not shock, something colder and more specific, recognition of a position that has been outflanked. I withdraw the motion, Prail said, in a voice that was very flat and very even. The chamber murmured. It was a real murmur this time, not the controlled attention shift of people processing procedure. Representatives were leaning toward their aides. Displays were being queried. The particular quality of a space where something has just shifted in a way that everyone can feel but not yet fully articulate. Webb stood and let it happen and looked at Prail. And Prail looked back, and neither of them said anything, and neither of them needed to. And then the ambient systems shifted. Lights, air circulation. The display panels, all of them simultaneously, cycling through status screens, showing the same information in whatever visual language each species in the room could read. No outbound signal, no inbound signal. The council station and every vessel docked to it, cut off from everything else. A tone from somewhere in the room. And then, cutting through the station's communication filters on a narrow-beam emergency hull transmitter that bypassed the standard network entirely and operated on a frequency band the disruption device hadn't been designed to block. 3 words from the Varanthi's second-in-command, comms are gone. 3 words. The narrow band closed a moment later. 3 words were enough. The communications blackout was total, deliberate, and immediately understood by everyone in the chamber for exactly what it was. Not a systems failure. The particular quality of a disruption that hits every channel simultaneously has a signature not random, not cascading, but clean, the signature of a suppressor rather than a breakdown. The council's technical staff appeared through a side door within 90 seconds and were clearly doing things that weren't working, because the things that would fix a system's failure were not the things that fixed a suppressor. Officials moved to their own devices, found nothing. The chamber had the organized chaos of people who deal with crises as a professional matter, but are dealing with a crisis in a domain they don't control. Saravin was at Webb's side in 4 steps. She spoke low in English because she wanted him to understand before anyone else did. Broad-spectrum communication suppressor. The technology to build one with this coverage requires Vekai trade infrastructure. It cannot be sourced through any concordance legal channel, which is itself evidence. Evidence we cannot currently transmit anywhere. How long do we have? Webb said. The suppressor requires sustained power from a source. Concordance station security will locate and neutralize it within. She paused. 2 hours, possibly less, possibly more. And in those 2 hours, every vessel currently operating under orders from either the Valkyrie command fleet or the Earth Defense Forces will be running on last received orders without update capacity. She looked at him directly. The engagement currently in progress in the Kepler system, the secondary front, 4 Valkyrie warships against 3 human defense vessels, has been running under a contested zone protocol that defaults to escalation if communications are disrupted for more than 30 minutes. Escalation to what?
Webb said. Full engagement, she said. 7 ships in close contact.
Full engagement in a contested zone means. I know what it means, he said. 7 ships. Full engagement, no ability to call it off. He looked at the chamber around them. Executor Prail had not moved from his seat. He was sitting with the particular stillness of someone managing a specific kind of patience, not the patience of waiting, but the patience of someone who has already passed to the other side of something and is simply waiting for the gap to close. His expression had the quality of a man who believes the outcome is already determined. Webb walked toward him. "Staff Sergeant," one of Saravin's guardians said. "I'm not going to touch him," Webb said. "I want to talk to him." He stopped in front of Executor Prail's seat. He looked at the being who had served on this council for 14 years, who had spent 14 years learning the timing architecture of the most important institution in galactic space, and using that knowledge to quietly drain the momentum from every attempt to stop a manufactured war, who had built something patient and nearly invisible and nearly impossible to disprove and had nearly succeeded. Webb spoke quietly enough that only Prail could hear him.
"I want you to understand that I recognize what you built," he said. 14 years.
That's not ambition.
That's commitment.
You understood what this institution was, and you learned it better than almost anyone inside it, and you used that understanding with real precision. There's a version of this where that expertise serves something worth serving. He paused. This isn't that version. But I want you to know I understand what you built, because what I'm about to say isn't about dismissing it. Executor Prail looked at him with the flat amber eyes of his species, waiting. "We have your travel records," Webb said. "Saravin's team has had them since I passed her the note in the first hour of this session, and they've had this entire session to cross-reference them with Vekai transit logs. What they've found is going into the formal record of this council today, not because of the comm disruption, which doesn't change what's already on record. It changes what happens in the Kepler system in the next 2 hours. It doesn't change what happens to you." He held Prail's gaze. "I'm telling you this not to threaten you. I'm telling you because there's still a choice in front of you. You can make it harder, and we will still get there. Or you can tell us where the suppressor's power source is, and 7 ships don't have to burn to prove a point that's already been made." Executor Prail was still for a long moment. "I have no information about any suppressor," he said. "All right," Webb said. He went back to Saravin. Prail's made his move 20 seconds later. A device he'd been carrying, not using the council network, something Vekai sourced, operating on a frequency band, separate from the suppressors, was out of his inner pocket and transmitting before his hand had fully completed the motion. Saravin's guardians were faster. The device was confiscated. The transmission hadn't completed. "For the formal record of this session," Saravin said, without raising her voice, addressing the chamber, "Executor Prail of the Sarai representation is being detained pending investigation of an unauthorized communication device and its contents. This is a violation of concordance diplomatic protocols," Prail said. He didn't say it with heat. He said it with the dignity of someone who has made choices and knows they will stand in the record and is choosing which face to wear while that happens. "File the objection when comms are restored," Webb said. He turned to Saravin. "I need something from you. I know what's in your Varanthi emergency hardware, the handheld physical transmitter in your emergency communications case. It's a standalone unit, its own power source, not networked. The suppressor has the network down, but it can't block a standalone physical array." She was already tracking ahead of him. "You know the human ceasefire code for the Kepler engagement zone." "Staff Sergeant cleared for Kepler contested zone operations," he said. "Field code, issued to any EDF personnel with that clearance, specifically for situations where central command comms go down and someone in the field has to call a halt. Broadcasts on a specific frequency band that every EDF vessel in that zone is required to monitor." "Every EDF vessel," she said. "Not Valkyrie vessels." "No," he said, "which is why I need you to give the counter order to your ships directly, through whatever physical array you have. You said you had a sealed diplomatic channel to the Varanthi command. Electromagnetic, direct beam. 2-minute transmission window," she said. 2 minutes is enough. He met her eyes. "Go now. You have more time pressure than I do. Your ships escalate before mine do." She moved. He watched her cross to the communications alcove at the edge of the chamber, where her staff had set up a physical array that bypassed the council station's networked infrastructure entirely. He watched her speak the subsonic harmonic of her voice, filling the alcove with more authority than any set of electronic credentials could produce, and watched the Varanthi's bridge receive it and respond and relay it to the 4 warships in the Kepler system's last orders, and waiting for the kind of escalation that last orders in a contested zone, always eventually produce. He waited until she was done. Now me, he said. The transmitter was a handheld unit that one of her guardians produced from the emergency communications case, low-tech by design, because reliable and low-tech were the same word in emergency scenarios, because the systems that saved your life when everything else failed were always the ones built for one specific job and nothing else. Webb took it, checked the frequency register, set it to the right band. He thought about Chen, about what it meant that Chen had known the routes were clear and held the station anyway, about the specific quality of that choice, not the quality of tactical calculation, but of something that existed before calculation, something that said these people are behind me, and I am the thing between them and the harm, even when the harm has already passed, even when there are no people left to protect. The reflex of it, the way it was so deeply built into some human beings that it ran even past the point where the math said to stop. He thought about 11 people who died in a war that someone else had manufactured for profit. He thought about the choice in front of him, the choice to send a ceasefire code to ships that were currently operating as the enemy, to vessels that had killed people he'd known and served with, to a conflict that had been costing his species lives for 18 months. And he thought about the fact that it wasn't really a choice. It had never been a choice, not for someone built the way he was built, not for someone who'd spent 12 years of his life being the thing between harm and the people behind him. It was just the next thing, and then the next. EDF Kepler zone vessels, he said into the transmitter, his voice steady in the particular way it got when everything else was already settled. This is Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, serial K479026, transmitting emergency ceasefire protocol on field code Alpha 7. All vessels in Kepler engagement zone. Ceasefire and hold position. Acknowledge when comms restore. Webb out. He lowered the transmitter. The chamber was very quiet. Saravan had come back to stand near him. He was aware of her presence with the particular awareness that comes when everything has been pared back to what's essential, not seeing, not calculating, just knowing where another person is. 16 minutes to Kepler at transmission speed, she said. 14 before the escalation threshold. That's enough, he said. They waited. The waiting had a specific quality, not the waiting of people who don't know what's happening, but the waiting of people who have done what they can do and are now in the interval before they find out whether it was enough. Webb sat down on the floor of the chamber. There was no nearby seat sized for him, and he was done standing. He pressed his back against the council dais and looked at the ceiling and let himself exist in the specific way you let yourself exist when the acute moment has passed and the adrenaline is clearing and what's left is just you and the weight of everything you've been carrying. Saravan looked at him for a moment and then sat down beside him, which he was fairly certain was not something a princess of the Valthyri Imperium typically did on the floor of the Concordance Council chamber, but she did it, and the proximity of another person of a person, specifically this person, who had made choices and carried them, was something he hadn't been aware he needed until it happened. After this, he said. After this, she said. You're going to have to tell your Imperium what you told this chamber, about the patrol order, about the decision. Yes, she said. I know. There will be people who use it against you. Yes, she said. And there will be people who understand that acknowledging a mistake and working to repair its damage are different from each other, and that the second one is stronger than the first. She paused. I have been told by humans that you have a word for this. Accountability, he said. Accountability, she repeated. The translation unit rendered it in Valthyri a moment later, and whatever the Valthyri word was, it was longer, more syllables. She'd told him, because the concept in Valthyri was more specific, breaking the act down into components the way precise languages did. What does the Valthyri version actually mean, he said. Roughly, the choice to carry the weight of what you have caused and walk forward with it rather than setting it down. She looked at him. You're Sergeant Major Chen. Yeah, he said. He carried the weight of what he'd caused the people under his command, the deployment, the decision to stay, and he chose not to set it down when he could have. She looked at the chamber around them, at the officials and representatives, and the contained chaos of a system trying to restore itself. That is the Valthyri version. I've been carrying a different version, Webb said. I know, she said. You have been carrying the weight of what you might have caused, the overload sequence, the choice to run it. I don't know if it was right, he said. You said that to me before, she said, in my quarters.
She looked at him directly. I have had Valthyri officers ask me if their decision was right. I have had commanders ask me across many years.
And I have learned that the people who are most certain a decision was right are often the ones who should have thought about it longer. The people who carry the question, who do not put it down, those are the ones I trust with the next decision. He was quiet for a while. If the ceasefire code works, he said, and the comms restore, and the evidence goes through, this war ends. It will take negotiation, she said. Formal processes. There will be people on both sides who resist, but it ends. It ends, she said. And then the Vekai Consortium, he said. They don't stop because they got caught. They operate on a 14-year horizon. They adapt. Yes, she said, which is why we will need, after all of this, a different kind of permanent relationship between your species and mine. Something that functions more like. She paused, searching. Something that functions more like what you do when two people have seen each other completely and decided to keep going anyway. Partnership, he said. Partnership, she said. Yes. The suppressor was located and neutralized 19 minutes after the comm blackout began. A power relay on one of the council station's external docking arms, traced by the station's security engineers through the specific draw signature it produced, a signature that shouldn't have been there. Concordance Security handled the neutralization with the efficiency of people who were very good at problems that had a physical solution. Communication systems restored globally. The Valthyri fleet in the Kepler system reported receiving Saravin's direct order and standing down from escalation protocol. The 3 EDF vessels in the Kepler engagement zone reported receiving field code Alpha 7 and holding position. None of the 7 ships had crossed the full engagement threshold. 14 minutes and 30 seconds. Webb closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. The formal proceedings that followed were thorough and methodical and entirely necessary and took several hours, during which Webb said approximately 400 words of testimony, and Saravan said several thousand. And the Concordance's legal machinery operated at the particular pace of institutions that understand their own permanence and apply that understanding to everything they touch. Executor Prail's communication device was confiscated, analyzed, and found to contain 11 years of message records encrypted, spanning multiple comm protocols. Documentation of an ongoing relationship between a Concordance official and a Vekai coordinating entity that would have taken a long time to read and a very short time to understand. Payment and access to timing, access to the specific knowledge of when information moved through the council and where the gaps were, the knowledge that took years of presence to accumulate, and that had been used, with real precision, for real damage. It was thorough, it was damning, it was enough. Prail didn't contest it. He sat with the dignity of someone who had calculated the remaining options and chosen which face to wear while they became part of the record. He filed the formal objection about the confiscation of his communication device because that was the right thing to do according to the rules, and the rules were the thing he had used and the thing he'd been used by, and perhaps that was appropriate. Webb didn't speak to him again. He'd said what needed saying. He hoped, in the specific and limited way that he allowed himself to hope about things he couldn't control, that the version of Prail's life that existed after this included something more than a cell, that the Concordance's investigative process would find the full structure and dismantle it, and leave behind people who might build something different. He didn't have a strong basis for that hope. He had enough basis to hold on to it anyway. What happened over the following hours was the careful, methodical process of bureaucratic structures doing what they do when presented with clear evidence and sufficient political will to act on it, moving slowly, honoring every protocol, producing language that was precise to the point of opacity. And that said, when you simplified it, the thing it needed to say. The Vekai Consortium was formally designated an agent of destabilization under the Concordance Conflict Standards Act. Investigation teams were dispatched. Member states were notified through the appropriate channels. The full scope of Vekai operational penetration into Concordance institutions was identified as a subject requiring urgent investigation, with preliminary findings due within 60 days. The engagement between the Valthyri Imperium and humanity was formally recognized as having been initiated through falsified sensor data manufactured by a third party. Both original vessel crews were exonerated of hostile intent. The legal status of the subsequent 18 months of conflict was reclassified as a conflict arising from manufactured provocation, which had implications for reparations, for territorial agreements, for the dozens of smaller decisions that had been made during those 18 months under the assumption of genuine hostility between two species who had, in fact, been building toward hostility for reasons manufactured by people who weren't in the room. It would take time. Everything would take time. People on both sides had died. That didn't unhappen because the origin of the conflict was understood. Grief didn't reorganize itself along more convenient lines just because you'd identified who was responsible for it. Webb sat with that in the quiet room, set aside for the parties. After the formal proceedings closed smaller than the chamber, atmosphere adjusted warmer, the kind of space that existed to allow people to come down from the altitude of having been under scrutiny for a very long time. He sat and he thought about Chen and Diaz and Marcos and Petra and the others, and he thought about what it meant that they died in a war someone else had manufactured for profit, and whether that was better or worse than dying in a genuine one. He didn't reach a conclusion. He was starting to think he wasn't supposed to. Saravan came to sit near him after the advisors, and the legal staff had cycled through and left, close enough that the warmth of another body registered even through the compromised atmosphere of the room. He'd been learning her concept of personal space over the last week, and he understood now that this was not an accident of different cultural norms. This was a choice. You're going to be asked, she said, by every news source and political operator on both sides of this thing, what your role was, how you ended up here, what you did. I argued, Webb said. You argued, she said. And then, with the precision he'd learned to recognize as her most careful version of sincerity, and then you trusted. He thought about the Kveth Narum, about standing in the center of a chamber, holding 31 species and saying the thing he'd never said out loud, because the situation required the truth and he was out of alternatives. About the specific quality of choosing to do that, not noble, not heroic, just the next thing that needed doing. One thing I want to know, he said. When you look at me and run whatever calculation the Val theory run, when they're trying to figure out what someone's going to do next, what do you get? She was quiet for a moment. Probabilities, she said. A person with your history and your particular set of experiences is most likely to do a specific set of things in a specific set of situations. The model is accurate for most purposes. She looked at him. It did not predict that you would refuse the Kveth Narum. It did not predict that you would argue. It did not predict that you would move between me and a weapon. It did not predict that you would send a ceasefire code to an enemy fleet and then sit down on the floor of the Concordance Council chamber and ask me what the Val theory word for accountability means. She paused. The things the model didn't predict were the things that mattered. That's humanity for you, Webb said. Yes, she said, that is humanity. And then, quietly, with the particular qualities she used when she was saying something that had been true for a long time and had only just found the right moment to be said, I have been studying your species for 8 years, trying to understand what you are. And what I have learned, watching you, is that you are not predictable in the ways that matter. You are the most difficult species in concordance space, not because of your weapons or your numbers, but because you make choices that no model accounts for. You stay in stations that don't need holding. You refuse rituals you don't understand. You send ceasefire codes to enemies you are currently losing to. She paused. That makes you the least manageable thing in the galaxy. It also makes you the most valuable when you're on the side of something real. We've had a lot of practice, Webb said, making choices that don't make sense from the outside. Yes, she said, you have. He thought about going home. He thought about debriefs and reports and the specific institutional machinery of a war being unwound. The paperwork of peace, which was always longer than the paperwork of conflict, and somehow always more important. He thought about the families of 11 people who deserved to hear from him directly, about what Chen had chosen and why, about what it had meant, about what they'd held and what had been built on that holding. When this is done, he said, I'm going home. There are people who need to hear things from me. I know, she said. And then there's going to be whatever comes next. Negotiations. Official things need someone human with Val theory diplomatic standing. There will be. she said. Yes, I'll come back for that, he said. If that's... Yes, she said, that is acceptable. He nodded. He stood up. He looked at the chamber beyond the room's transparent wall, the chamber where the most important thing he'd ever done had happened mostly by accident, growing out of a refusal and an argument and a cut on his shoulder from station debris and 11 people who weren't here. The Kfethnarim, he said, the patterns on your wall, the ones you said are all dead. Yes, she said. I'm not dead, he said. She looked at him. Something in the frost glass patterns on her cheekbones shifted very small, but a movement toward rather than away, an opening rather than a closing. He was learning to read her, slowly, the way you learn to read a person you've decided to know, rather than just observe. No, she said, you are not. He walked through the door. The Concordance station's corridors were brighter than the Varanthes had been, warmer, light, different air quality, the compromise atmosphere of a space built for everyone, and therefore exactly right for nobody. He walked through them and thought about what it meant that he'd started this week as a prisoner of war and was ending it as something the Concordance didn't have a clean category for. He was still human. He was going to stay that way. Whatever came next, whatever form the partnership between his species and hers took, whatever negotiations and processes and long, difficult institutional work came after the acute crisis had passed, he was going to be himself in it. Stubborn, argumentative, prone to making choices that didn't make sense from the outside. Prone to standing between harm and the people behind him, even when the people behind him were already safe. Capable of trust when the situation was right and the cost was clear, and someone stood in front of him having already paid what they could. He thought about Chen, walking out of a station and into whatever came next, carrying the weight, walking forward. That was the move. It had always been the move. He walked forward.